Now we will navigate through this 5G era. So, today's demo introduction. CSPs are exploring innovative ways to monetize their investments as well as to reduce the cost. The enhanced 5G advanced cases combined with Nokia innovation expand these possibilities for new services that create value beyond standards to add revenue recognition with advanced capabilities to operators. Now I will take you through a few 5G advanced solutions that Nokia has come up with, and these Nokia innovations, how they are going to help operators in recognizing new revenue by not adding any additional infrastructure demands, but by reusing the existing infrastructure along with existing identities. The first one being the federated authentication, as we just discussed. We facilitate this federated authentication using AANF, that is ACMA anchoring function, which is getting added to Nokia AES of UEDM CNF as a new value-added microservice. This extends CSP capability with authentication as a service. Example use cases, we can provide this authentication for any content provider in the world. And the second one is we extend the current keys for facilitating secondary authentication as well. That means we don't require any new authentication environment. We don't require any new identity to get this secondary authentication done. Instead, reuse existing mobile identity along with primary authentication credentials that are already done for this mobile to make use of the same and give the secondary authentication to same end user. Thus avoids demand for any third-party involvement, where everything contained within operator network itself. Now, how we can accommodate this slightly enhanced traffic within the same operator domain? Yes, when there is a secondary authentication, there will be a slight extra traffic that come in, and we facilitate that by using an AML-driven auto-scaling, which gives them a flexibility to scale required services on demand than creating and keeping all of them always available and ready. So I'll just give you a brief view of how this works at the network level. An example is a federated authentication. I just picked that because that is the most widely used one. Today, how third-party authenticator or authentication service providers are using this environment and providing secondary authentication to devices as well as content providers. Example, if we use a mobile like what we are seeing here, a user who is having a mobile or a device at home, maybe a smart TV, logs into a given application. That can be a YouTube, that can be a Netflix, that can be an Amazon Prime, that can be any other content provider. When they try to log into that, they will always prompt for a user ID and password. This is where a third-party authentication servers are coming in. To avoid independent user IDs for each application or from each content provider, a lot of these content providers are tying up with third-party authentication servers like Google or Facebook or Apple or Amazon, wherein they try to use the existing Google ID or a Facebook ID or an Amazon ID and just authenticate them, saying that yes, he is an authenticated user, so that you can proceed and give the service. Where these third-party authentication providers charge a portion from content providers, where content providers are going to pay a portion of their revenue towards them. How and what it helps for these content providers? Content providers are relieved from all authentication as well as identity management. So that's how it is working. Today, I just gave an example here for a YouTube. When somebody is logging into YouTube at mobile or at a device at home, it will prompt for a user ID. Example, one can authenticate themselves using a Facebook ID or a Google ID, where that request goes to a third-party identity provider, in this case, Facebook, towards a Facebook server or a Google server, depending on which identity he is using, and they authenticate this device and let content provider admit this device to start using YouTube. How we transform this using Nokia innovation? The same mobile or the same home device, when they're logging into any content provider service, the request will go to the content provider's authentication server earlier. Now we are eliminating that. Now we are bringing AANF, which is ACMA anchoring function, as a service into Nokia AES of UDM CNF, which facilitate this secondary authentication, which does a similar job of what actually the third-party service provider earlier doing and getting some portion of the revenue from content provider. When mobile or a home device is trying to log into any of these content provider service, the request goes to the corresponding application server, and the application server relays that to AENF, which is part of Nokia AES of UDM CNF as a service, gets this secondary authentication request, completes the secondary authentication using the same identity that is used for mobile network, nothing but regular SDN of a given device. By doing this, we eliminate the third-party server in between as a secondary authentication server, the need for another identity that is expected to be created by user, and the need for involving a third party into the entire process. Thus, an operator coming into the secondary authentication path makes additional revenue generation out of it by adding nothing beyond anything that is existing in the current network. So this gives a new opportunity for every operator to bring the existing customers to get themselves authenticated for every secondary service that they're using by using their mobile or their home device. Now, to facilitate this extra traffic, slightly extra, it's not volumes of traffic, but slightly extra traffic beyond what this network is already carrying, we added the 5G scaling or the context-based ML algorithm to enhance current capabilities to scale the existing services to match the demand of the traffic that is coming out of the secondary authentication. And what we call this is called predictive auto scaling, that is added to the existing CNF, which facilitate the scaling out of these services, nothing but ACMA anchoring function, which is added as a service to AES of UDM CNF, to scale on demand and to facilitate and accept the additional traffic and give the end-to-end service that is required for completing the secondary authentication. Now, with all this, what we are doing, we are giving a seamless end-user experience without asking to create any new identity or any new password or asking any content providers to keep any third-party server or a third-party authentication service to come into the end-to-end process. Now I will demonstrate one use case for this secondary authentication. I took one example, Netflix as an example for providing content to the end user. The end user in this case is a mobile network user who is having his own SDM. He is trying to watch a video from Netflix using his mobile. How it goes? He will be first primary authenticated when the device is getting added to the network. And when he wants to use the Netflix service, he will be secondary authenticated by AENF service that you see here in a different color to distinguish and say that this is a new service which is giving this value added capability to operator network. We put this in another color. So when a mobile is coming to the network, first it does primary authentication followed by secondary authentication when he is actually asking for that service from Netflix. I'll show this call flow. When I click this content or application access through this Netflix use case, in this internal call flow, I simulated the primary authentication. I simulated the mobile which initiates the primary authentication, where Nokia AES of UDM gets this primary authentication, completes a primary authentication process, and as part of a follow-up activity from the same mobile, we initiate a Netflix access, which initiates a secondary authentication towards application function here, which in turn asks this ACMA anchoring function to complete the secondary authentication process. Let me go and show you that. How it will allow this secondary authentication to get completed. Post that, once secondary authentication is done, we also connect to Netflix to watch a movie, and here we also applied a control from core network that this authentication is valid only for 30 seconds. Hence, post that 30 seconds, he has to re-authenticate. Just to complete the demonstration, we limited it only for 30 seconds, but it can be extended to any number of hours or days as operator policy. That's what the additional controls I'm referring to. It is not that once he is authenticated forever, but it can also be controlled for a specific duration. Hence, operator as well as content provider can together decide all these network policies and controls through which they can really allow the end users to use these services for how long. That can be hours, or it can be days, or it can be weeks or months, depending on his subscription. Now let me show this demonstration of the call flow. I'm authenticating the subscriber using primary authentication, which is done. Once the primary authentication completes, the secondary authentication is getting initiated from the mobile to the application function. But during primary authentication, the Nokia AES of UDM shares required credentials with AANF. Hence, AANF can make use of that for secondary authentication.
Well, that was both said when he does what I call it, price trolls though.
When mobile is attached into the network, the primary authentication is carried out by AES of UDM. Once the primary authentication is done, the primary authentication outcome with required authentication credential is shared with AANF service by AESF, and this AANF service keeps this primary authentication outcome and its credentials in UDSF repository. Why it keeps? Whenever a secondary authentication request comes to AANF, it uses this primary authentication outcome and credentials to authenticate and give the secondary authentication for this device. Why the primary authentication outcome? Because it's the same device and the same identity of that device, nothing but MSISD, is getting reused in the network, which is a value add. That is exactly what we are trying to facilitate. So what's happening at the end? By adding just a AENF as a service into the existing AES of UDM CNF, the existing operator was able to give any secondary authentication to any content provider or any web application or any other web service provider, or even for any e-commerce service provider. The secondary authentication plus the very strong based out of very strong primary authentication that is well proven for decades in telco network. This avoids the need for third party in the network for content providers and additional identities for end users and additional infrastructure either for content providers or for operators. Instead, reusing existing identities, existing authentication credentials, existing authentication framework, existing network, and provide what all required on internet that is as on today exists and what is going to come in future. This is what the facilitation that we are providing with this innovative idea of Nokia that help every operator not only to extend their capability but prepare for future and see more revenue from different extents of use cases that are going to come from 5G, and as well as what are the use cases that are already existing today. That's what this Nokia innovation is. This comes with not only authentication, but it can apply any control that is required. Like as we said before, if operator want to apply this secondary authentication for a very time limited window, like a day, and get it re-authenticated again, hence he can have a pure control on how long this end user can make use of this service as per end user and content provider alignment. And the same can be controlled from operator network. Earlier, that is required to be controlled from content provider environment, which he can delegate to operator, or he can still keep that with operator and use operator network for secondary authentication, or delegate secondary authentication as well as these additional controls, so that the content providers gets relieved out of all these extra overheads and can only focus on creating, maintaining, managing the content, and rest of it is taken care by operator network, which is established and well proven one for all authentications and user controls that are getting applied for making use of any network service. In this case, content providers are also one of the network services that are offered to these end users through either an operator agreement or a direct content provider alignment. Thank you.